The Dark Story of the Sultana. America's Deadliest Shipwreck. April 1865. The Civil War has ended. Lincoln is dead. And on the Mississippi River, a steamboat packed with freed Union prisoners explodes. 1,800 men die. More American deaths than the Titanic. More than Pearl Harbor's USS Arizona. More than any single maritime disaster in United States history. But you don't know the story. Why? Because 13 days earlier, the president was assassinated. Because the war just ended and the nation was exhausted. Because the men who died were already ghosts, skeletal survivors of Confederate prison camps, anonymous in their suffering. And because someone got paid, a kickback, $1,100 in 1865 money. $31,000 in today's terms. Cash changed hands between a Union Army officer and a steamboat captain. The deal was simple. Pack the boat beyond capacity. Ignore the legal limit of 376 passengers. Load 2,400 men instead. Collect $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer. Do the math. That's $11,500 for one voyage. $325,000 in modern money. The boat had failing boilers. The chief engineer knew it. He protested. He was overruled. The boilers were patched with metal too thin to hold. The boat departed anyway. The Mississippi River in late April is cold, 55 to 60 degrees, wide, over a mile across at flood stage, fast current, dark at night. When the boilers exploded at 2 a.m., the men had nowhere to go. Fire spread through the wooden decks. The only escape was into black water that would kill most of them within an hour. 1,800 men died, more than the Titanic, forgotten, and you've never heard of it. If you want to understand how America forgets its own tragedies, how money corrupts even in moments of liberation, and why the worst disaster in our history gets buried under better-known stories, stay with me. This is the investigation the history books skipped. Please hit subscribe. Your support makes deep dives like this possible. Let's begin. April 27th, 1865. 2 a.m. Mississippi River, 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. The water is black and wide, swollen by spring floods to over a mile across. Normal width is half that. The current runs fast and cold. The temperature of the river is 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to kill a healthy man in 1 to 3 hours. These men are not healthy. On the surface, a side-wheel steamboat churns north. The Sultana, 260 feet long, 42 feet wide, 4 tall smokestacks, a long white superstructure with passenger decks stacked 3 levels high. From a distance, it looks like a floating wedding cake, elegant and fragile. Up close, the illusion collapses. The Sultana is overloaded to the point of catastrophe. The official capacity is 376 passengers and crew. Tonight, there are approximately 2,400 human beings aboard. Most are men, Union soldiers, former prisoners of war, emaciated, sick, wearing rags. They fill every surface, the decks, the cabins, the cargo hold, the stairwells. They sit shoulder to shoulder. They sleep standing up. The boat rides low in the water, the paddle wheels half submerged. Every railing is lined with bodies. Men cling to ropes tied to the smokestacks. Others sit on the cabin roofs. The weight distribution is uneven. The boat lists slightly to starboard. The air smells of sweat, river mud, coal smoke, and unwashed men. Beneath the beauty is a machine running at its breaking point. Below deck, deep in the hull, 4 tubular boilers roar. They are iron cylinders packed with water tubes and fireboxes. The boilers generate steam to drive the engines that turn the massive paddle wheels. The pressure inside exceeds 1,000 pounds per square inch. In an era when most steamboats operated at 600 to 800 PS1, the Sultana's high-pressure system was cutting-edge technology. It was also dangerous. The chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, has been watching the boilers with growing concern. One of the 4, the middle larboard unit, is leaking. It was patched 3 days ago in Vicksburg. The patch was not done properly. Instead of replacing the bulging section with a riveted steel plate, a mechanic applied a thinner piece of metal and some sealant, a temporary fix. Wintringer knows this. He also knows the boat is on a schedule. The men above him are desperate to get home. The owners want profit. No one wants delay. The boilers are running hot. The steam pressure climbs. The gauge needles hover near the red zone. Wintringer considers shutting down one boiler to reduce the load, but that would slow the boat. The captain, J. Cass Mason, wants speed. Mason is on the upper deck. He is not watching the boilers. He is calculating profit. Wintringer decides to keep all 4 boilers running. At 2:15 a.m., the Sultana passes a cluster of islands known as the Hen and Chickens, about 8 miles below the mouth of the Wolf River. Most of the men are asleep or trying to sleep despite the crowding. The night is cool. A few stand near the railings watching the dark water slip past. One of them will later recall the silence, the way the river seemed endless, the way he felt safe for the first time in months. Then the boilers explode. 3 of the 4 boilers rupture simultaneously. The explosion is not a single blast. It is a sequence. First, the weakened larboard boiler gives way. The patch fails. Superheated steam at over 300 degrees Fahrenheit escapes at explosive velocity. The sudden pressure drop causes the adjacent boilers to fail within a fraction of a second. The combined force is catastrophic. The shock wave moves outward at the speed of sound. Superheated steam fills the lower decks instantly. Men sleeping in the hold are scalded alive. Their skin blisters and peels in seconds. The steam is invisible but lethal. It cooks lungs, blinds eyes. The men don't have time to scream before they die. The boiler metal tears apart. Iron fragments the size of a man's torso become projectiles. Some pieces punch through the wooden deck planks above. Others fly horizontally, tearing through walls and bodies. One fragment severs a man at the waist. Another takes off someone's head. The shrapnel does not discriminate. It cuts through anyone in its path. The force lifts the center section of the boat several feet into the air. For a moment, it hangs suspended. Then it crashes back down. The central deck, where hundreds of men were sleeping, pancakes. The upper deck collapses onto the middle deck. The middle deck collapses onto the lower deck. Men are crushed between layers of wood. Bones snap. Bodies are compressed into spaces too small to hold them. The smokestacks, no longer supported, topple. 2 fall forward. 2 fall aft. Each weighs several tons. They crush everyone beneath them. Men who had tied themselves to the stacks for safety are carried down. The pilot house, perched atop the boat, slides forward and crashes into the water. The initial explosion lasts perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, at least 200 men die, scalded, crushed, impaled, or thrown into the river. The destruction is total in the center third of the boat. That section simply ceases to exist. What remains is a gaping hole surrounded by splintered wood and twisted metal. Fire breaks out immediately. The coal bunkers near the boilers ignite. The fire spreads to the wooden superstructure. Within minutes, the entire midsection of the boat is burning. The flames are orange and white hot, fed by dry wood, tar, paint, and oil. The heat is intense enough to ignite clothing at a distance. Burning timbers collapse onto men trapped below. The fire does not care who it consumes. Smoke fills the air, black and choking. It carries the smell of burning wood, burning coal, and burning flesh. Men wake to find themselves surrounded by fire. Some are already on fire. Their clothes, their hair, their skin. They run, some jump, some freeze in terror, some drop to the deck and crawl. The smoke is so thick they cannot see. They follow the sounds of other men. Sometimes those sounds lead to safety. Sometimes they lead to more fire. Panic is immediate and total. 1,800 men wake to a nightmare. A burning, exploding, sinking boat in the middle of a river over a mile wide. The river is dark. The current is fast. The water is 55 degrees. But the alternative is to stay and burn. So men start jumping. The ones near the stern and bow have a chance. Those sections are still intact. The fire has not reached them yet, but the fire is spreading. It moves forward and aft along the wooden decks. It climbs the cabin walls. It follows the paint and tar. Within 15 minutes, the stern is burning. Within 30 minutes, the bow is burning. There is no safe place left on the boat. Men crowd toward the railings. They push each other. Some jump, some are pushed, some fall. The railings, already weakened by the overload, break under the pressure. Entire sections collapse, spilling dozens of men into the black water. They hit the surface and disappear into the current. The Sultana does not sink quickly. The hull remains partially intact, but the middle is gone, replaced by a roaring furnace. The boat drifts south with the current, burning like a torch. From Memphis, 7 miles away, people see the glow in the sky. They do not yet know what it means. For men who jump or are thrown from the Sultana, the river is a second disaster. The explosion and fire are immediate threats. The water is a slow killer. The Mississippi in late April is cold, 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, a healthy adult has about 1 to 3 hours before hypothermia sets in. Fatal hypothermia. These men are not healthy. They are malnourished, weakened by months of imprisonment. Many weigh less than 100 pounds. Their bodies have no reserves. Hypothermia comes faster. The progression is predictable. Within 10 minutes, the cold penetrates. Muscles begin to stiffen. Within 20 minutes, fine motor control deteriorates. Fingers stop working. Swimming becomes difficult. Within 40 minutes, major muscle groups fail. Arms and legs stop responding. Consciousness begins to fade. Within an hour, most are dead. The heart slows. Breathing stops. The body shuts down. Add the current. The Mississippi at flood stage moves at about 4 miles per hour. Faster in the center channel where the Sultana exploded. A man in the water is pulled downriver even if he tries to swim toward shore. The force is relentless. It drags bodies south, away from Memphis, away from help. The combination of cold and current is lethal. Some men try to swim to the Arkansas shore, the western bank. The distance looks manageable in the darkness. In reality, it is 3/4 of a mile. In daylight, with calm water and a strong swimmer, this is possible. At night, in 55-degree water with a strong current, after months of starvation, it is nearly impossible. Most drown before they make it halfway. Their bodies are found later, washed up on sandbars and snags. Some with their hands still reaching forward, frozen in swimming position. Others grab debris, doors, planks, pieces of cabin wall, shutters, anything that floats. These men have a chance, if they can hold on, if they can avoid the current, if rescue comes quickly. The problem is grip strength. Cold water makes hands numb. The debris is slippery. Men lose their grip and slide under. Some try to climb onto larger pieces, a door, a section of deck. The weight pushes the debris underwater. It does not support them. They slip off and drown. Some form groups, 5 or 6 men clinging to a single door. They share body heat. They encourage each other. They pray. Some groups stay together for hours. Others break apart when men lose strength and let go. The ones who let go do not fight. They are too cold. They just sink. The water closes over them silently. And there are other dangers. Multiple survivors mentioned alligators. The Mississippi River in 1865 has a population of American alligators, especially in the warmer southern sections. While the water near Memphis is colder than alligators prefer, they are opportunistic. The chaos, the blood, the bodies in the water may have attracted them. One survivor, Private William H. Peacock, later testified that he saw alligators in the water that night. He did not know if they attacked anyone. He only knew he stayed as still as possible. Another survivor, Simeon Chelf, reported seeing a man dragged under. He could not confirm what took him, but the description matched an alligator attack. The reports are disputed. Some historians believe the survivors were mistaken. That exhaustion and hypothermia caused hallucinations, that floating logs were misidentified. But multiple men, independently, described the same thing, and alligators were present in the river. The possibility cannot be dismissed. The Sultana had no lifeboats. Steamboats in 1865 were not required to carry lifeboats. There were no life jackets, no flotation devices of any kind. The boat was insured for its value as property. $60,000, $1.7 million in today's terms. But the passengers were not insured. Their lives had no cash value. No safety equipment was mandated. No inspections required life-saving gear. The men jumped into the river with nothing but their clothes. The rescue effort begins around 3 a.m. when the explosion is first heard in Memphis. But Memphis is 7 miles south. It takes time for word to spread, time to organize boats, time to launch. The first rescue boats reach the area around 4 a.m. By then, many men have been in the water for 2 hours. They are unconscious or dead. The rescuers pull bodies from the river. Some are alive, most are not. The steamboat Bostona II is heading south when its crew sees the burning wreck around 4:30 a.m. The captain immediately orders a stop. Crew members throw ropes and lower small boats. They begin pulling men from the water. Some survivors can grab the ropes. Others are too weak. Sailors jump into the 55-degree water to secure them. The Bostona II saves over 160 people. Some are conscious. Most are not. The USS Tyler, a Union Navy gunboat anchored at Memphis, sends rescue boats around 4 a.m. after crew members hear the explosion and see the glow upstream. Tyler is a timber-clad gunboat, 180 feet long, commissioned in 1861 for river patrol. It carries small boats for boarding operations. Sailors row out into the river, searching for survivors. The work is difficult. The current pulls debris and bodies downstream. The darkness makes it hard to distinguish living men from dead. Sailors call out. Sometimes men answer, sometimes they don't. Private citizens respond from Memphis. Fishermen and ferrymen launch whatever boats they have. Rowboats, skiffs, flatboats. Some are barely large enough for 2 people. They go out anyway. The river at Memphis is normally half a mile wide. At flood stage, it's 3/4 of a mile. These small boats cross that distance repeatedly, looking for anyone still alive. One man, John Fogelman, a civilian ferryman, saves 16 men. He rows out at dawn, finds a man clinging to a door, pulls him into the boat, rows to shore, unloads, rows back out. He does this 16 times. Each trip takes about 30 minutes, rowing against the current, searching the debris field. By midday, he is exhausted. His hands are blistered, his back is cramping, but he keeps rowing because men are still in the water. By the time he stops, there is no one left to save. The rescue effort continues through the morning. The wreck of the Sultana drifts past Memphis around 5 a.m. What's left is a skeleton. The bow and stern are still partially afloat, barely connected by charred timbers. The midsection is gone. Smoke rises from the remains. Bodies are visible in the wreckage, burned beyond recognition. People line the Memphis riverbank. They watch the wreck drift past. They send more boats. Bodies are recovered for days. Some wash up along the banks. Some are caught in snags and eddies. Some float as far south as Vicksburg, 100 miles away. Recovery teams work the river for a week. They find men who jumped near Memphis and drifted south overnight. They find men who almost made it to shore. They find men who died holding on to debris. The Mississippi gives up its dead slowly. The soldiers who survive are taken to Memphis hospitals. They are treated for hypothermia, burns, broken bones, shock, and smoke inhalation. Many are in worse condition after the disaster than they were after imprisonment. Some die in the hospitals within days. Their bodies were too weakened to recover. The irony is brutal. They survived Andersonville. They survived the war. They almost made it home. The official count is uncertain. somewhere between 1,700 and 1,900 men died. The exact number is unknowable. The army did not keep precise records of how many men were loaded onto the Sultana. Estimates range from 2,300 to 2,400 passengers total. Roughly 600 survived. That means approximately 1,800 dead. The Titanic, 50 years later, killed 1,517 people. The worst maritime disaster in American history happened in the middle of the country, on a river, on a steamboat no one remembers. To understand who these men were and what the disaster meant, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the end of the war, and to the worst places in the Confederacy. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee surrenders the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War is effectively over. Scattered Confederate units will continue fighting for weeks, but the outcome is decided. Across the South, Confederate prison camps hold thousands of Union soldiers. These men have been waiting for this moment, some for months, some for years. The conditions in Southern prisons are catastrophic. Andersonville in Georgia is the most infamous. Camp Sumter, its official name. 33,000 Union prisoners passed through Andersonville over the course of the war. 13,000 died there. The camp was designed for 10,000 men. At its peak, it held over 32,000. The overcrowding was deliberate. The Confederate Army lacked resources to feed its own soldiers. Prisoners were the lowest priority. Andersonville had no shelter. No barracks, no tents. Men built lean-tos from whatever they could scavenge. Scraps of cloth, sticks. Some dug holes in the ground and lived in them. The camp was 26 acres surrounded by a stockade wall. Inside, there was one stream for water. Sweetwater Creek. It entered at one end, flowed through the camp, and exited at the other. Men used it for drinking water, bathing, and as a latrine. The same stream. By the time the water reached the center of the camp, it was contaminated with human waste. Dysentery was universal. Scurvy was common. Gangrene infected any wound. Men died of exposure. They died of starvation. The daily ration was a pint of cornmeal and a few ounces of rancid meat. Sometimes there was no meat. Sometimes the cornmeal was full of weevils. Men ate it anyway. The alternative was death. Some prisoners resorted to eating rats, anything to survive another day. When Union forces arrived in May of 1865, many prisoners were too weak to walk. They weighed 70 or 80 pounds. Their skin was stretched over bones. Their eyes were sunken. Their teeth were falling out from scurvy. Some could not stand. Some could not speak. The liberators were horrified. Photographs taken at Andersonville show men who look like skeletons. The images shocked the North. They fueled anger. They demanded justice. Camp Cahaba near Selma, Alabama was smaller but equally deadly. 3,000 men held in a space designed for 500. The prison was a cotton warehouse, brick walls, dirt floor, no ventilation. When the Alabama River flooded in March of 1865, water rose to waist level inside the building. Men stood in filth for days. The water was cold. It carried disease, dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The death rate at Cahaba was proportionally worse than Andersonville. When the war ended, the Union Army moved quickly to evacuate these camps. The men were to be transported north, processed at Camp Chase in Ohio, and sent home. The route was determined by geography. Most camps were inland. The nearest major transportation hub was the Mississippi River. Vicksburg, Mississippi became the primary staging point. Prisoners were marched or carried to river ports. From there, steamboats would ferry them north to Cairo, Illinois, then trains to Ohio, then home. For men who survived Andersonville and Cahaba, the promise of freedom was overwhelming. They had endured starvation, disease, violence. They had watched friends die. They had buried men in mass graves. They had given up hope and then found it again. The war was over. They were going home. The steamboat ride was supposed to be the easy part. 2 days on the river. then trains, then their families. The tragedy of the Sultana is not just that 1,800 men died, it's that they had already survived the unsurvivable. They were the lucky ones, the ones who lived through Andersonville, the ones who made it out of Cahaba. They were days from home, hours from safety, and then a steamboat captain decided their lives were worth less than money. The deal was made in Vicksburg. Cash changed hands between two men. One wore a Union Army uniform, the other commanded a steamboat. The exchange took seconds. The consequences killed 1,800 men. Captain Reuben Hatch was a Union Army quartermaster stationed at Vicksburg, Mississippi. His job was to arrange transportation for freed prisoners of war. He was supposed to ensure safe passage, adequate capacity, fair distribution across available boats. But Hatch had other priorities. Money. He had a reputation. Earlier in the war, he had been investigated for selling government supplies for personal profit, selling military boots to civilians, diverting food shipments, reselling government horses. The charges were never fully prosecuted. Hatch had connections. He knew how to navigate military bureaucracy. The investigation faded. He kept his position. By April of 1865, Hatch was still in Vicksburg, still arranging transportation, still looking for opportunities. When the war ended and thousands of prisoners needed transport, Hatch saw profit. The government was paying $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer. For a boat that could legally carry 376 passengers, that was about $1,900 per trip. In today's money, roughly $54,000. Not bad for a two-day journey up the Mississippi. But Hatch had a better idea. Why spread the passengers across multiple boats when you could pack them all onto one? More men per boat meant more money per trip. All he needed was a steamboat captain willing to overload and a willingness to ignore the rules. Hatch had both. Enter Captain J. Cass Mason, age 34, commander of the steamboat Sultana. Mason was under pressure. The Sultana was not profitable. The boat cost $60,000 to build in 1863, $1.7 million in modern terms. Operating costs were high. Coal, crew wages, maintenance, repairs, competition was fierce. Dozens of steamboats worked the Mississippi. Profit margins were thin. Mason needed a big contract. Hatch offered one. The terms were straightforward. Hatch would assign all available prisoners to the Sultana, as many as could fit. Mason would take them, all of them. In exchange, Mason would pay Hatch a kickback of $1,100, about $31,000 in today's money. For Hatch, this was easy money, a single transaction, no risk. Just turn a blind eye to the overloading and collect the payment. For Mason, the math was compelling. The government rate was $5 per enlisted man, $10 per officer. If he loaded 2,400 men, mostly enlisted, he would earn approximately $11,500. $325,000 in modern terms. Subtract the $1,100 for Hatch. Subtract operating costs. He would still clear a massive profit. One voyage, 2 days, more money than he had made in months. The only cost was risk. Mason decided he could manage the risk. Overloading was common, not to this degree, but steamboat captains routinely bent capacity rules. Inspections were lax. Enforcement was rare. If he loaded carefully, distributed the weight evenly, and avoided rough water, he could make it. The Mississippi was calm in April. The weather was clear. The journey to Cairo was routine. He had made the trip dozens of times. He knew the river. He knew his boat. He could do this. The legal capacity of the Sultana was 376 passengers and crew. This was determined by the boat's design, its displacement, the strength of its hull, the power of its engines. Federal law required steamboats to display their capacity. The Sultana's certificate was posted in the main cabin, 376. The number was not arbitrary. It represented the maximum load the boat could safely carry. Beyond that, the risk of capsizing increased. The strain on systems increased. Safety margins disappeared. Mason and Hatch ignored the number. On April 24th, Hatch directed approximately 2,400 former prisoners to board the Sultana. The men arrived in groups. They had been told they were going home. They were grateful. They climbed aboard without question. They did not know about the capacity limit. They did not know about the kickback. They did not know the boilers were failing. They trusted the army. They trusted the captain. They trusted they would make it home. The Sultana filled, then overfilled. The decks became crowded, then dangerously crowded. Still, men kept boarding. Mason watched. He did not stop the loading. The boat sat lower in the water with each group. The paddle wheels sank deeper. The boat listed slightly. Still, men kept coming. By the time loading was finished, every space was occupied. The cargo hold, the cabins, the stairs, the deck. Men sat on the cabin roofs. They tied themselves to smokestacks. They hung from ropes along the sides. From the dock, the Sultana looked ready to capsize, but it did not. It floated, barely. Mason gave the order to depart. The date was April 24th, 1865. Destination, Cairo, Illinois. Expected journey, 2 days. During the stop in Vicksburg, before loading the prisoners, Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer discovered a problem. One of the Sultana's 4 boilers had a bulge, the middle larboard boiler. The iron shell was weakening. Under steam pressure, the metal was deforming. Wintringer had been watching it for days. The bulge was getting worse. He reported it to Captain Mason. He recommended a full repair. The proper repair would require removing the boiler from the boat, draining it completely, cutting away the weakened section of the iron shell, fabricating a new steel plate to fit, riveting the plate into place with dozens of strong rivets, pressure testing the repair, then reinstalling the boiler. The work would take 3 to 4 days, maybe longer if the local boiler shop was busy. Vicksburg had facilities for steamboat repair. The town was a major river port. Multiple machine shops and foundries served the steamboat trade. The work could be done properly. It would just take time. Mason could not afford a 3-day delay. He had just secured the most lucrative contract of his career, 2,400 passengers and $11,500. If he delayed, the army might reassign the prisoners to another boat. The contract would evaporate. Worse, he had already paid Hatch the $1,100 kickback. If the deal fell through, he would lose that money. Mason needed the boat operational immediately. He ordered a temporary patch, find a mechanic who could fix it quickly, get the boat moving. Wintringer protested. A temporary patch was not safe, not at the pressures the Sultana's boilers operated. The boat's high-pressure system ran at over 1,000 pounds per square inch. Most steamboats ran at 600 to 800 pounds per square inch. The Sultana's system was more powerful, more efficient, but also more dangerous. A weak repair would fail. Wintringer knew this. Mason overruled him. A local mechanic, R.G. Taylor, was called to the dock. He examined the bulge and agreed with Wintringer. A proper repair was needed, but he also understood that captains often pushed back on costly repairs. Taylor offered a compromise. He could apply a patch, a piece of thinner metal riveted over the bulge. It would hold for a while, maybe long enough for the journey to Cairo. After that, a full repair would be mandatory. Mason accepted. The patch was applied on April 24th. The repair was inadequate from the start. Taylor used metal that was too thin. The patch covered the bulge but did not reinforce it properly. The rivets were adequate, but the underlying problem remained. The boiler shell was weak. Under pressure, the metal would continue to deform. The patch might hold for a few hours, maybe a day, but not indefinitely. Taylor knew this and mentioned it to Mason. Mason chose to proceed. The cost difference was significant. A temporary patch cost about $50, less than $2,000 in modern money. A full boiler repair would cost between $300 and $500, $10,000 to $17,000 today. For Mason, the choice was obvious. Spend $50 and keep the contract, or spend $500, lose 3 days, and risk losing everything. He chose the patch. Wintringer watched the repair. He knew it was insufficient. He documented his concerns in the boat's log. If something went wrong, he wanted a record. But he was the engineer, not the captain. Mason had the authority. Wintringer's job was to follow orders and keep the boat running. He could advise, he could warn, he could not refuse. On April 24, 1865, the Sultana departed Vicksburg with a known boiler defect. The patch was visible. The bulge was still present under the thin metal. The risk was obvious to anyone who looked. No one looked. The army officers who supervised the loading did not inspect the boilers. The passengers did not know to ask. Hatch did not care. He had his money. Mason had made his choice. Wintringer had done what he could. The Sultana steamed north with 2,400 men and a bomb in its belly. The journey upriver began slowly. The Sultana was overloaded. The boat sat deep in the water. The paddle wheels had less bite. The engines strained. But the boat moved. North on the Mississippi. Away from Vicksburg. Away from the prison camps. Toward Cairo. Toward home. The men were in surprisingly good spirits despite the crowding. They sang songs, told stories, played cards with scraps of paper. They shared the meager rations they had been given, hardtack and salt pork. Some men had tobacco. They passed it around. They talked about home, who they would see first, what they would eat, where they would sleep. For many, it was the first time in months they allowed themselves hope. The hope was fragile. These were not healthy men. They weighed 70 to 90 pounds. Their clothes hung on skeletal frames. Their skin was pale and stretched. Some had open sores that would not heal, scurvy, dysentery, infections. But they were alive. They were free. The boat was uncomfortable, but temporary. In 2 days, they would reach Cairo, then trains to Ohio, then discharge papers, then home. Sultana made stops along the way. Helena, Arkansas was the first. The town sat on the Mississippi about 70 miles north of Vicksburg. The boat docked briefly to take on coal. A few passengers disembarked, mostly civilians who had boarded in Vicksburg. The soldiers stayed aboard. The stop lasted less than an hour. Then the boat continued north. Memphis, Tennessee was the next major stop. The boat arrived in the evening of April 26th. Memphis was a significant river port. The city had been occupied by Union forces since 1862. It served as a supply hub for military operations in the Western Theater. The docks were busy with steamboats, barges, and military vessels. The Sultana tied up at the Memphis wharf. The purpose was to take on more coal. The boat's bunkers were running low. During the stop, something remarkable happened. A photographer named Thomas W. Banks set up his camera on the dock. He took a picture of the Sultana. The image survives. It is the only known photograph of the boat on that voyage. The image shows the decks packed with men. They are standing, sitting, leaning on every railing. The crowd is so dense that individual faces blur together. Men sit on the cabin roofs. They hang from the sides. The smokestacks are barely visible through the mass of bodies. It is a document of overload. A warning that was not heeded. Bankers sold copies of the photograph later. It became evidence. The men on the boat did not know they were being photographed for history. They waved at people on the dock. Some called out. Others just stared. They were tired, but they were close now. Memphis to Cairo was about 200 miles. At the Sultana's speed, that means 20 to 24 hours. By the next evening, they would be in Cairo, almost home. The boat left Memphis around 6 p.m. on April 26th. The plan was to continue through the night. Below deck, the boilers ran hot. Wintringer monitored the pressure gauges constantly. The patched boiler was holding. The pressure was high but stable. He considered venting steam to reduce the load, but that would slow the boat. Mason wanted speed. The men wanted to arrive. Wintringer decided to keep all 4 boilers running at full pressure. The night was cool. The moon was out. The river was calm. The men settled in for the night. Some found spots to lie down. Most could not. They sat or stood. They talked quietly. Some sang hymns. Others prayed. Many simply watched the dark water pass. The stars were bright. The air smelled of pine and river mud. For a few hours it was almost peaceful. Then midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Then 2. At 2:15 a.m., 7 miles north of Memphis, the patch failed. The Sultana disaster killed more Americans than any other maritime disaster in history. The death toll was higher than the Titanic, higher than the General Slocum ferry fire in New York, higher than the Eastland capsizing in Chicago, and yet it is almost unknown. Why? Timing. The Sultana exploded on April 27, 1865. Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated 13 days earlier, on April 14th. The nation was in mourning. Newspapers were consumed with Lincoln coverage. His funeral train traveled from Washington through Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and finally to Springfield, Illinois. Millions of people lined the route. Newspapers ran daily updates. Editorial pages eulogized the fallen president. The entire country was focused on one story. On top of that, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth dominated headlines. Booth fled Washington after shooting Lincoln. Federal troops and detectives pursued him across Maryland and Virginia. The chase gripped the nation. Every newspaper covered it. Every day brought new developments. On April 26th, the day before the Sultana exploded, Booth was cornered in a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia. He was shot and died the next morning. April 27th, the same day as the Sultana disaster. The timing could not have been worse. When the Sultana exploded, newspapers had two massive stories competing for space: the death of Booth and the riverboat disaster. Booth won. His death was the culmination of the biggest manhunt in American history. The Sultana was a tragedy, but it was a tragedy that happened far from the centers of power, on a river in the South, to ordinary soldiers, men without names or connections. The Sultana did receive some coverage. The Memphis newspapers reported the explosion in detail. The Memphis Argus ran a front-page story on April 28th. Other regional papers picked it up. The New York Times published a brief article on April 29th, buried on page 4. The headline read, "A terrible disaster on the Mississippi." The article was 5 paragraphs. It gave the basic facts. An explosion. Hundreds dead. Then it moved on to other news. Within a week, the story disappeared. National newspapers stopped covering it. The focus remained on Reconstruction, on Booth's conspirators who were still being rounded up, on the question of what would happen to the South now that the war was over. The Sultana became a footnote. Then it was forgotten entirely. Geography played a role. The disaster happened in the South, on a river, far from the major population centers of the North. Most of the victims were from small towns in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Kentucky. They were not from New York or Boston or Philadelphia. They were farmers and laborers, men without political connections or wealth. Their deaths did not matter to the people who controlled the newspapers, or to the government officials who made decisions about what stories to investigate and which to bury. There was also the matter of responsibility. The disaster was caused by corruption and negligence. The army did not want to investigate itself. The steamboat companies did not want regulation. The government did not want to admit that men who survived Confederate prisons were killed by Union incompetence and greed. It was easier to call it an accident, mechanical failure, no one's fault, and then move on. The Titanic is famous because it killed wealthy people. First-class passengers included some of the richest men in America: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus. Their deaths were news. The Titanic also happened on the Atlantic Ocean, where European and American newspapers could both cover it. It had a narrative that fit the progressive era's obsession with technology and hubris, the unsinkable ship that sank. It was a story people wanted to tell. The Sultana had none of that. It killed poor men. It happened in a region the North wanted to forget. It was the result of corruption, not hubris. And the government actively suppressed the story. No major investigation, no accountability, just silence. That silence lasted for over a century. Captain Reuben Hatch, the quartermaster who took the $1,100 kickback, was court-martialed. The army could not ignore the corruption entirely. Too many people knew. Survivors talked. Families of the dead demanded answers. The Memphis newspapers had reported the overloading. The photograph taken by Thomas Banks showed the crowded decks. Evidence existed. So the army convened a court-martial in August of 1865. The charges were specific. Hatch was accused of accepting bribes, of willfully endangering soldiers, of violating army regulations regarding transport capacity. The case seemed straightforward. Multiple witnesses testified that Hatch directed all 2,400 prisoners to the Sultana. The boat's capacity certificate was produced, 376. The overloading was undeniable. Hatch's financial records showed irregular deposits around the time of the Sultana's departure. The evidence pointed to guilt. Then the charges were dropped, mysteriously. The official reason was lack of sufficient evidence, but multiple historians have noted the implausibility of that explanation. The evidence was abundant. Witnesses were available. Documents existed. The more likely explanation is that Hatch had connections. He knew people in the War Department. He had information that could embarrass senior officers. Whatever the reason, the court-martial ended without conviction. Hatch was reassigned. He continued his military career. He was eventually promoted. He died in 1904, never prosecuted, never punished. The boiler inspector who approved the Sultana's departure from Vicksburg was never charged. His name was lost to history. The army did not pursue him. The mechanic who applied the faulty patch, R.G. Taylor, was never questioned. No investigation examined whether he warned Mason about the inadequacy of the repair. No one asked whether Taylor should have refused to do the work. He disappeared from the record. J. Cass Mason, the captain of the Sultana, died in the explosion. He could not be held accountable. His body was recovered from the river days later. He was buried in Memphis. No charges could be filed against a dead man. For the families of the dead soldiers, this was another injustice. The man most responsible was beyond reach. The official report concluded that the disaster was an accident, boiler explosion due to mechanical failure. No mention of overloading, no mention of the kickback, no mention of the ignored warnings from Chief Engineer Wintringer. The report framed the explosion as an unfortunate but unavoidable event. Steamboats exploded, boilers failed, it was a risk of river travel. Nothing could have been done. No one was at fault. The army buried the story. The families of the dead received no compensation. The soldiers had been on active duty when they died, but the army ruled that the disaster was not a combat death. Therefore, no benefits were owed. The families were left with nothing, no money, no pension, no recognition. Just a letter informing them that their son or husband or father had died in a steamboat explosion, drowned or burned. The body may or may not be recovered. Most victims were buried in mass graves in Memphis. Some were identified, some were not. The graves were unmarked. No national ceremony was held. No memorial was erected. The government wanted the story to disappear. And it did. For decades, the Sultana was forgotten. Textbooks did not mention it. History courses skipped it. The worst maritime disaster in American history became a secret, known to a few, ignored by the nation. The message was clear. The lives of ordinary soldiers were cheap. When they died due to corruption and negligence, no one would be punished. The system protected itself. The men responsible walked free. The victims were erased. For over a century, the Sultana was a footnote in history books, a paragraph at most, often nothing at all. The disaster was too uncomfortable, too revealing of corruption, too distant from the heroic narratives Americans preferred. The victims had no political power, no wealthy descendants to fund memorials or commission histories. They were poor men from small towns. Their deaths were forgotten because forgetting was convenient. Then, slowly, a few people began to remember. In 1982, a small memorial was erected in Memphis. A simple granite marker near the site of the old river landing. It lists the names of some of the dead. Not all. Many names were never recorded. The memorial is modest. Most people in Memphis do not know it exists. But it is something. A physical acknowledgement that 1,800 men died there. Local historical societies in Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan began collecting survivor accounts in the 1970s and 80s. They found letters, diaries, pension applications. Some survivors had written about the disaster. Most kept silent. The trauma was too great, but a few left records. These documents were gathered, copied, archived. Descendants of the victims started researching their ancestors. They wanted to know what happened, why their great-great-grandfather died on a boat they had never heard of. In the 1990s, a few books were published, local histories, self-published accounts. They did not reach wide audiences, but they kept the story alive. In the 2000s, a documentary was made. It aired on regional television. It told the story accurately. It named Hatch. It explained the kickback. It showed the photograph taken by Thomas Banks. The documentary was a small step. It brought the disaster to a few thousand viewers. Most of the country still did not know. The wreck of the Sultana rests somewhere at the bottom of the Mississippi River. The exact location is unknown. The river has changed course multiple times since 1865. Channels have shifted. Islands have formed and disappeared. The wreck may be buried under silt. It may have been carried away by floods. It may lie somewhere under farmland that used to be riverbed. Multiple searches have been conducted. Nothing has been found. The boat is gone, swallowed by the river. What remains are the stories. Survivor accounts describe the cold water, the screams, the burning boat drifting past Memphis, the rescuers pulling bodies from the river for days, the mass graves, the injustice of the cover-up. These stories were passed down through families, whispered at first, then written, then published, then finally recognized. The disaster matters because it reveals something fundamental about how societies remember. We remember what serves us. We remember heroes and villains. We remember stories with clear morals. We remember tragedies that fit our narratives. The Titanic fits, rich and poor on a doomed ship, hubris punished, the band playing as the ship sinks. It is a story that teaches lessons we want to hear. The Sultana does not fit. It is a story of corruption, of poor men killed by greed, of a government that covered up its own failures, of a nation too exhausted to care. It is a story that indicts institutions we are supposed to trust, the army, the courts, the press. It is uncomfortable, so it was forgotten, deliberately, systematically, for over 100 years. But forgetting is a choice, and it is a choice that dishonors the dead. 1,800 men deserved better. They survived Confederate prison camps. They survived starvation and disease. They survived the war. They were going home. They were killed by a steamboat captain who valued money over lives, by an army officer who took a bribe, by a system that ignored warnings and punished no one. They deserved justice. They deserved compensation for their families. They deserved a memorial. They deserved to be remembered. Instead, they were erased, their names forgotten, their deaths minimized, their story buried. For over a century, the worst maritime disaster in American history was treated as if it never happened. The men on the Sultana were not heroes. They did not die in battle. They died on a riverboat, burned or drowned, killed by incompetence and greed. But their deaths matter. They matter because they reveal the cost of corruption. They matter because they show what happens when institutions fail. They matter because forgetting them is a moral failure. So why don't you know this story? You know it now. The Sultana, April 27, 1865. A steamboat on the Mississippi River, packed with 2,400 freed Union prisoners. Legal capacity, 376. An army officer took a $1,100 bribe. A steamboat captain chose profit over safety. The boilers were patched with metal too thin. The engineers warned. The warnings were ignored. At 2 a.m., 7 miles north of Memphis, the boilers exploded. 1,800 men died. More than the Titanic. More than any single maritime disaster in United States history. You did not know because the nation chose to forget, because 13 days earlier, Lincoln was assassinated, because John Wilkes Booth died the same day as the Sultana, because the men who died were poor soldiers from small towns, because the disaster happened in the South, far from the centers of power, because investigating it would reveal corruption, because the army did not want accountability, because the government buried the story. The Sultana matters because 1,800 men died, but it matters more because of how they died. They survived Confederate prison camps, Andersonville, Cahaba. They survived starvation that killed 13,000 other men. They survived disease, exposure, violence. They were liberated. They were going home. And then a Union officer decided their lives were worth $1,100. A steamboat captain decided his profit was worth more than their safety. The boilers exploded. They burned or drowned. Their families received no compensation, no explanation, just a letter. Your son is dead. Steamboat accident. Nothing could be done. The cover-up was systematic. Hatch was court-martialed. The charges were dropped. He was promoted. He died rich and unpunished. The boiler inspector was never questioned. The mechanic who applied the patch was never charged. Mason died in the explosion, beyond accountability. The official report called it an accident. The army refused to pay benefits. The victims were buried in mass graves. The story was erased from newspapers, from textbooks, from memory. The Sultana reveals how power protects itself, how institutions avoid accountability, how the deaths of ordinary people are dismissed when it is convenient. The men on the Sultana had no voice, no money, no political connections. Their deaths were inconvenient, so they were forgotten. For over 100 years, the worst disaster in American history was treated as if it never happened. But forgetting is a moral failure. The men on the Sultana deserve to be remembered, not as heroes. They did not die heroically. They died because someone took a bribe, because a captain wanted money, because a mechanic cut corners, because regulators did not regulate, because the system failed. Their deaths reveal the cost of corruption, the cost of placing profit above human life, the cost of institutional cowardice. 1,800 men, more than the Titanic, and you never heard their names. That is the real tragedy. Not just that they died, but that they were erased, their suffering dismissed, their families denied justice, their story buried because it was uncomfortable. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe to the channel, share this video, make sure these men are not forgotten again. Talk about the Sultana, use their names if you can find them. Tell people that the worst maritime disaster in American history did not happen on the Atlantic. It happened on the Mississippi. It happened because of corruption, and it was covered up. In the comments, tell me what other forgotten tragedies you want investigated. There are so many stories history buried. Let's bring them back. Thank you for watching. Remember the Sultana. Remember the 1,800. Remember that forgetting is never an accident. It is always a choice. 600 men survived, but survival was not salvation. The men pulled from the Mississippi were broken. Hypothermia, burns, broken bones, smoke inhalation, internal injuries. Some died in Memphis hospitals within days. Their bodies could not recover. They had survived Andersonville, survived the explosion, but the combination was too much. They died anyway. Others lived but were permanently damaged. Private Chester Berry from the 20th Michigan Infantry clung to a door for 6 hours in 55-degree water. He was pulled from the river at dawn, unconscious. His hands were frozen in a grip position. Doctors had to pry his fingers open. He recovered enough to travel home, but his hands never fully healed. The joints stiffened. He could not farm, could not work. He applied for a disability pension. The application was denied. The army ruled his injuries were not combat-related. He died in poverty in 1891. Joseph Taylor Stevens, from the 103rd Ohio Infantry, survived by swimming. He was a strong swimmer before imprisonment. Months of starvation had weakened him, but he still had the technique. When the boilers exploded, he jumped. He swam toward the Arkansas shore. 3/4 of a mile. He made it. Barely. He collapsed on the bank. A farmer found him at dawn. Stevens recovered physically. But he never spoke about the disaster. His family knew he had been on the Sultana. They knew he survived. They did not know the details. Stevens died in 1919. His children learned the full story only after reading newspaper accounts years later. William Bohr, from the 64th Ohio Infantry, survived by grabbing a wooden hatch cover. He floated on it for 8 hours. The current carried him south, past Memphis. He was rescued by a civilian fisherman near a place called President's Island, 10 miles south of the explosion site. Bohr was treated in Memphis. His burns healed. He went home to Ohio. He married, he farmed, he had children, but he had nightmares for the rest of his life. Screams, fire, black water. His wife learned not to wake him suddenly. He died in 1920, 55 years after the disaster. He never stopped dreaming about it. The survivors who made it home faced another challenge. No one believed them. The disaster was not widely reported. Most people in Ohio and Indiana and Michigan had never heard of the Sultana. When survivors told their stories, people assumed they were exaggerating. A steamboat explosion that killed more people than the Titanic? Impossible. The survivors learned to keep quiet. Some joined veteran organizations, the Grand Army of the Republic. They found other survivors. They shared their stories with each other, but they did not talk publicly. The trauma was too raw. The disbelief was too painful. Many survivors applied for pensions. They had been wounded on the Sultana, burns, broken bones, lung damage from smoke inhalation, permanent disabilities. But the Army did not classify the disaster as a combat injury. The pension applications were denied. Some survivors appealed. The appeals took years. Most were denied. The survivors were left with medical bills, ongoing care, lost wages from inability to work, no compensation, no recognition, just silence. A few survivors wrote accounts. They described the explosion, the fire, the water, the rescues. These accounts were published in local newspapers. Small-town weeklies in Ohio and Indiana. They reached limited audiences. National publications ignored them. The stories were filed away in county historical societies, forgotten along with the disaster itself. The survivors aged. By the early 1900s, most were dead. A handful lived into the 1920s and 30s. The last verified survivor died in 1936. His name was Jordan Barr. He was from Indiana. He was 17 years old when the Sultana exploded. He lived to be 88. When he died, he was one of the last people alive who remembered. The newspapers did not report his death. There was no memorial service for him as a Sultana survivor. He was just another old veteran, another name in the cemetery. The survivors carried the weight of the disaster for the rest of their lives. They had nightmares. They avoided rivers. Some refused to ride boats. They told their children a little, but mostly they kept silent. The nation had forgotten. The survivors internalized that forgetting. They stopped talking. They stopped trying to make people remember. They died quietly, and their stories died with them. Until a few descendants, decades later, began asking questions.